We're recording.
Okay.
Okay, can everyone see my first slide in here? Okay, very good. Well,
Yes.
thank you very much for having me talk. I'm happy to share my research project, and this is a project that I'm doing as a student at the University of Texas at San Antonio. So I'm working on my master's degree. And my research goals were to determine the population abundance of Texas horned lizards in Karnes and Wilson County. Then I wanted to utilize community science reports to build that data set, and using the two, see if I could correlate where the lizards occur with a habitat type or a vegetation community. So I started my research in 2020, and I'm continuing through this season. So through the talk, I will cover how I began my research and then how it changed. So I had to adjust my strategy and even adjust my research question as I concluded the first season where I surveyed for data. And then just kind of finish up with what my goals are now and what I hope to get this summer with community science reports. Okay. So I think most of you know what Texas horned lizards are. Generally, we refer to them as horny toads, but they're not actually toads. So I always try to use the proper terminology when I refer to them. But they're a really unique and charismatic lizard that has endeared itself to many of us. If you grew up in Texas, you can see the blue area. Their range once covered almost all of Texas and extends into several states as well as south into Mexico. And this small lizard is flattened dorsally, so it's kind of smashed down as compared to other lizards. It's covered with spines, so that's where it gets its name, horned lizard or horny toad. And it's kind of unique. It's got the diet specialization where it feeds primarily on ants, and those are typically medium-sized to larger ants, or we often associate them with harvester ants or cut ants. So that's what we think they feed on predominantly. They can shift their diet to include other insect species. In fact, the juveniles can't consume harvester ants. They're too large for them to physically consume. So they need medium-sized ants or other insects to fit that diet. Because of this specialization, the exoskeleton or the outer shell of an ant is not digestible. So in order for a horned lizard to consume enough ants to meet its caloric needs, it has to have a extra large stomach. So I think that's one thing that I really identify with. This is a flattened, pot-bellied little lizard that's slow moving and a little bit awkward. And so I really, I think that's why I can catch them easily. And that makes me love them. And maybe some of us can identify with having that little pot belly and moving a little bit slower. So they're pretty neat. However, they're listed as state threatened. And so we have them listed as state threatened. You would assume, and we say that there are population declines, but we really don't have good population abundance data. We don't have comprehensive data, certainly not statewide. Most of the data we do have is from a Parks and Wildlife effort that began in the 90s, and surveys were conducted to determine occurrence. And then we've continued now. We have an iNaturalist project that's a statewide effort that picks up any sightings of horned lizards. And so what we do know is where they still occupy habitat. And so basically, if you go west of the I-35 corridor, you can still find populations of horned lizards. And for the most part, east of the I-35 corridor, they're believed to be extirpated or extinct from those areas. So the habitat that you would typically find horned lizards, or what the research indicates that they prefer to exist in, is described as a sparsely vegetated rangeland or scrubland. And when I look at the eastern third of Texas, I don't always envision sparsely vegetated rangeland, but they once occurred throughout that area. So That struck me as interesting and a gap in the data. The causes for declines are pretty common among any threatened species. Habitat loss is generally a reason why you see population declines. And for the horned lizard in Texas specifically, we've seen land use changes. So as people have left their rural areas and moved to urban centers, um, lands that were once working lands, farmlands or ranch lands, have been left fallow, and then you see encroachment of brush or shifts in the plant communities when that land is no longer actively worked. We also see a lot of urban expansion. So anyone familiar with I-35, you know it's almost a continuous suburb or major metropolitan area. And then east of that, we have several other large metropolitan areas. So you can see potentially why they would be extirpated in the eastern part of the state. Introduction of exotics, the red imported fire ant, I know we were talking about earlier, that ant displaces our native harvester ant, so it can, the primary diet of the horned lizard can be reduced with the introduction of red fire ants, and then just the nature of that exotic ant. They're so aggressive that we really actively try to eradicate them. And we do that with indiscriminate broadcast pesticide application. And when that happens, you eliminate all ant species, both the native and the exotic invasive ant. So you could really remove any dietary option for the horned lizard because of that one species. We also have many exotic grasses, and this can be because of improved grasses for hay production or for erosion control. So a lot of our highways and roadsides were intentionally seeded with grasses that have a sod forming growth pattern that reduces plant diversity, which then reduces insect diversity. So again, you've reduced or eliminated any food prey items for the horned lizard. With that sod growth pattern, you potentially limited or eliminated their ability to move around. So it's a small flattened lizard. It's not easy for it to get around in a real thick KR blue stem or Bermuda grass or Bahia grass pasture. And then habitat fragmentation. And so the eastern third of Texas is very fragmented, highly fragmented. I think that the rest of Texas will see the same thing happening over time. It hasn't quite reached the extent of eastern Texas. And then we have oil and gas exploration. And so we've seen that statewide, but it's increasing in the southern part of Texas and western Texas. So research indicates that horned lizards are fairly sensitive to human disturbance. And so as you have fewer and fewer unbroken large tracts of land, you have more infrastructure on working lands with the oil well pads or pipeline right-of-ways, roads, oil field roads. It will eventually impact lizard populations over time. So my objectives were to answer some of these questions, and I started, my efforts were focused on Karnes and Wilson counties specifically for a variety of reasons. One, universally, any landowner I encountered was interested in the horned lizards, wanted to know where they were at, why they don't see them anymore, and what they can do to help. And so I knew with that universal interest and support, it was really, it would really help me gain access. And I do. I had access to many ranches across the counties, but because of limitations with time and funding, I could only survey so many locations. So I agreed to survey 9 properties scattered among the 2 counties. And also I was interested in this area because this is along that eastern edge of their known occupied site. So this is where the plant communities are typically blackland prairie, post oak savanna, or South Texas brush. And so it's right along the edge of where we know they are known to occupy. And so I wanted to see, are there still remnant populations? If you are familiar with Karnes County, Karnes County proudly has the city of Kennedy, which is known and noted as the Texas horned lizard capital. And so they have that designation. They have a park where they've committed to creating horned lizard habitat. So they're very proud of that designation and the horned lizard population that exists and has existed within that city. So I know that within the recent past, lizards would have been found across both counties. So the detectability of horned lizards is difficult. And I knew that from any person I spoke with that knew anything about lizards, any research that I reviewed in preparation for my research, I knew that detectability would be difficult. And that's for several reasons. The cryptic coloration is essentially their camouflage. And if you look at this photo, this was taken in a little bit further south where the soils have kind of a reddish hue, and you can see this lizard, the color matches quite nicely. So it blends in, and you're lucky to see one unless they move. In parts of Karnes and Wilson County where we have lighter soils or more gray soils, the lizards match that substrate too. So reptiles have a really great adaptation to, even within a small geographic area, to begin to match the coloration of the substrate that they exist in. And so that in of itself makes it difficult to find these animals when you're conducting surveys. And then low population densities. So the animals may exist across the landscape, but you're never going to find a large concentration. Even in excellent habitat, you may not find a large concentration. They're scattered not very densely across the habitat. So that really increases the chances of not picking up one when you're conducting a survey. And then if you look at the photograph in the top right, that's actually one of my transects where I conducted a survey. And that's fairly typical of a lot of the habitat I encounter in Karnes and Wilson County. So the vegetation is fairly thick. And I really can't say with certainty that thick vegetation makes it impossible for a horned lizard to exist, but it definitely would make it more difficult for me to detect the horned lizard. So it could be that people don't see horned lizards in that habitat. We see them in the sparsely vegetated areas, but that's only because it's easier to see them in those areas. And they also have a defense mechanism to remain motionless. And so maybe something that makes them uniquely Texan is that they will stand and fight. So they have their spines, they have the ability to shoot blood out of their eye. So they don't run from predators. They'll typically remain motionless. In that, without some kind of movement, it's really hard for us to pick up where those lizards are sometimes. So I started my field research last summer, and I started with visual encounter surveys. And this is a really common survey method for an animal like a horned lizard. It's used to monitor lizard populations and amphibian populations. So creatures that are pretty small and have a very small home range or don't move very far throughout their daily movements. Each of my transects was 60 meters long and 3 meters wide. And I would survey a transect for 4 consecutive days between sunrise and 1 o'clock of the afternoon. So the lizards are more active in the morning as the day warms up, but before it gets unbearably warm, that's when you see the most activity from lizards. So that is when I would conduct my surveys. I did consecutive days. So if I potentially missed a lizard on a transect on day 1, I had three additional days to maybe see it. Maybe it wasn't out feeding when I was there. Maybe it was still submerged under a substrate and I missed it. So the multiple days increases your odds of picking up that detection. It took me a couple of months to complete all of my transects, and I did not detect a single lizard. So that was disappointing to say the least. But But I knew that on 3 of my sites or ranches, there were confirmed sightings of horned lizards. So once I concluded my transect surveys, I went to the locations where I knew there were lizards to see if potentially it's me. You know, there could be an observation error on my end. Maybe I don't know what a lizard looks like. I don't know. So I go to these areas where I knew lizards had been detected that year or in a previous year, and I conducted searches and walked miles. I didn't find lizards, live lizards, but I did detect them via their scat. And so these are examples from the left, moving to the right, the most degraded scat to the freshest scat. So the one on the right is probably less than a day old or a few hours old. It's very distinct. There's always going to be that white speck on the scat, which is urates, and then it's going to be comprised of the undigestible exoskeleton from the ant shells. And so you can see all of those ant shells in the scat. So I found 33 scat among the 2 sites. So again, I knew there were lizards on the ranches, not on my transects, but I still hadn't seen a lizard. So I still wanted to test and see if it was an observation error, a detectability issue. So along a portion of my transects, I set game cameras, and then I set game cameras in 2 of the known occupied sites. So each camera was approximately 4 feet off the ground and angled about 45 degrees down, and set with a 3-minute delay. The cameras had a field scan option where they would just take a photograph at a certain timed interval. And so this function I used because I wasn't certain if the movement of the lizard would trigger the camera. When I set those cameras on the transects, if there were harvester ant mounds on the transect or very close to the transect, that's where I would set it. Otherwise, I would choose the area with the least vegetation. And this was to limit or minimize the number of false triggers. And so anytime the grass blows or any movement at all would set off the camera. So I tried to avoid that as much as possible. But some sites, you can see from the one photograph, that's the least vegetation I had available. So it's fairly solid grasses. I got a lot of really interesting and neat wildlife photos. So if you ever thought about setting a game camera, pointing it down at the ground can be quite interesting and running it all summer. I got over 100,000 photos, and I did get one of a horned lizard. So you can see the arrow pointing at this little guy. He blends in with that substrate perfectly. Over 100,000 photos, and I got one of a lizard. So cameras will detect lizards. You can tell if they're present, but you can't identify the individual. So you can't identify them by their pattern on their back or their dorsal view. So you only can get presence data. You still cannot determine population abundance with a game camera survey. And with the duration that I ran the cameras, the number of photos I got for one lizard photo, I'm not certain that the reward is worth the effort on that if you are really trying to find horned lizards. So the remaining portion of my research was based on community science reports. And I'm really glad I recognized detectability would be an issue because I have no data from my efforts at all. All of my data has come from community science reports. So every bit of data I'm going to use is community science reports. I tried to utilize every platform I could think of that would reach an audience to send out my request for sightings. So I did use my role as a Parks and Wildlife Biologist and use my listserv to send out my requests. I used partner agencies and asked if they would send out to their listserv, and they readily agreed. I utilized the local wildlife management associations and co-ops, probably people I had already reached, but maybe not. They were very nice and posted my requests on their Facebook or sent out to their membership. I created an iNaturalist project and posted this online. I advertised this at any along with any of my requests. It was anytime I was allowed to present at an event, I mentioned that and had the link to that iNaturalist project. So I did present at local events. I did know I needed to build the interest in this project because, and that was lucky for me and uh, complete luck. I had no idea that COVID would happen. And so if I had waited until a month before field season started, that would have been March last year. And so all of the local events were canceled in my area. So they did not have the ability to create Zoom meetings or provide Zoom meetings for their membership, and so I really just missed all of those typical local events where I have the opportunity to speak and engage with people. If I hadn't done it from that fall through January, I missed out my opportunity because of COVID. This year, I've done essentially the same thing with the listservs using the Wildlife Management Association. I still have my INAT project online, but I added a few additional efforts. I'm using the University of Texas Environmental Science Instagram account to host a takeover. So I'll post a series of photographs and requests over a series of days requesting sightings via that platform. And I wrote an article that will be published in the Wilson County News, and that will go out. So it's, I just have tried to reach as many different audiences as possible, recognizing that each platform kind of, you have a typical membership or audience with each platform, so that can be tricky. The community response has been great. As I mentioned before, that's where all of my data has come from. So I wouldn't have 31 sightings is enough sightings to be statistically valid and meaningful. So I can do something with this. This is essentially from the 2020 season. So if I'm only going to build that number with this 2021 season. What did surprise me about the response is I thought I would get most of my sightings reported via the iNaturalist platform, and I only had one sighting reported on that platform. The person that reported on that, I have no idea who it is. I don't know that they saw my request. I don't know that they are aware of my research. I think most likely they just saw a lizard and posted it on iNaturalist because they're aware of that platform. So luckily, I noticed people were telling me about lizards, sending me photographs, talking to me about seeing them. And I kept checking the iNaturalist, and there were no sightings. So I contacted them back and asked if they were going to post it or why they hadn't. And there were privacy concerns. And the concerns seemed to either be a reluctance to post on an online platform where someone can see a threatened species that's on your private property, or not wanting to allow access to your device. So for the platform to access photographs and could potentially access other information on your device. And so those are real concerns. So I quickly adjusted and sent out my request saying, just text me a photograph with georeference. So send me a lat long, drop a pin in your mapping app on your phone, or turn on the location settings on your camera and send me the photograph. And people had no problem doing that. They have no problem with me using the data, publishing the data. They simply don't want it posted on iNaturalist. So here you can see almost exclusively my sightings have been in Karnes County. And I have heard from folks that there's a fairly uniform representation of the counties, both counties. So I have a lot of, we used to see them, we no longer see them, and those would be in the parts of the counties you don't see anymore. So it lines up pretty nicely. There's a handful of absences down within the presence, but it seems like there's a change in the plant communities where the sightings are being found. So for me, and I think other scientists who are looking at similar species, threatened species, declining species, or species that, or they're in states like Texas where we're 95% privatized, community science data is essential. I would have no research were it not for all of the sightings and reportings that I'm getting from people. Um, I think a lot of luck kind of allowed this to happen for me. Whoops. Um, my role as the biologist, I think, provided some level of trust with the landowners and me using that data. Um, I already had an established relationship among the community, and I think that really benefited me. Um, so anyone seeking research grade data needs to look to the local community and needs to have those established relationships. Um, and that requires collaboration. So I use partner agencies. I used my resources as a Parks and Wildlife biologist to do that and build that. I did use social media. I used it more this year than last year. I did that because I felt like it was a very quick and easy way to reach a lot of people. I recognize that there's a bias with any kind of community science data you get. So many people, as I mentioned, so certain demographics are going to take the published newspaper, and I had articles in the San Antonio paper, the UTSA News, and the Wilson County News. Each one is going to reach a different target audience, but I'm going to miss a lot of audiences. I work with a lot of absentee landowners. Some live in the San Antonio area, but many live in Corpus Christi or Houston. So I don't think that I would have the ability to get an article published or have an interview with one of those papers, since the local community is so removed from those metropolitan areas. So I missed a lot of opportunity with that area. I think potentially younger people use social media. So I would guess that many of my landowners are middle-aged to older adults, and I don't think they're on social media quite as often as the younger demographic. But potentially the younger demographic is a family member and is on the property to see and sight and report the horned lizard. I did mention, or I don't know if I mentioned, but the Texas Parks and Wildlife has a Herps of Texas iNaturalist project, and that picks up horned lizard sightings. They have over 1,300 sightings in Texas, and only 4 or 5 were from Karnes County, none reported in Wilson County. The ones that were reported in Karnes County were all in Karnes City or Kennedy. So again, I think there's very serious concerns with privacy. And so in a private land state, having that trust and that ability to get people willing to provide data on private lands is pretty critical. Luckily, that seemed to work out for me. So I just in one season, I had 31 sightings, all on private lands. I think I found one in Floresville when I was walking. And then the one iNaturalist sighting was in Kennedy. So as an organization, I think you might have a lot to offer me, potentially how to reach more audiences, how to effectively reach audiences and garner interest to keep the interest in this project and keep it going forward. So I wasn't just interested in sightings last season. I'm very interested this season, and my primary focus is citizen science data in 2021. So I'm not going to be conducting visual encounter surveys or game camera surveys this year. I think all my efforts need to be on community science data. So I am actively seeking that. I'm asking you, if you see the horned lizards, please report those to me. I have some contact information here. My iNaturalist project, in case you're not averse to using iNaturalist, and then my focus counties. So I've also expanded my focus counties. The reason I did this is my research goals have shifted a bit. Because I could not locate horned lizards on my transects, I can't do abundance data. The best I can do is presence data. So I can say with certainty, this animal was here because I have a photograph and it's geo-referenced. So I can say, I know where the lizard occurs. Since I can't go to every single sighting and conduct my habitat assessment, I can't really correlate that with habitat. So what I'm doing is using a mapping program and a modeling program. And the more sightings I get, the stronger my model will be. And I can say, well, horned lizards occurred in all these sites, and this model predicts they could potentially occur in these other similar habitat types. And so it would be based on things like vegetation communities, precipitation, or temperatures, because those seem to be strong predictors of horned lizard presence based on other research. So my focus counties, you can see listed here. I encourage you to share the research project if you know anyone in these areas and can help me with the research. So this is my last field season, and I'll conclude next fall. I really appreciate your time, and I will go to the chat to answer any questions if there are any questions. So I see Melinda Creech commented that you used to play with horny toads near Katy Prairie. Is that in the Houston area? Am I right? So I'm from Tyler, Texas, which is definitely East Texas, piney woods, and I grew up catching horned lizards myself. So I know they occurred in what is not described as habitat in the literature. So I think, I don't think they're as specialized as we once thought they were, but there is some sort of combination of what's right and what's wrong for horned lizards. And I'd like to be able to answer those questions. Let's see, Mr. Donald, you said, is data needed for other counties? Yes. So my specific research for this master's, I'm starting with these few focal counties, but this is something that eventually, I think Parks and Wildlife as an agency, other biologists in other counties would be interested. There is the statewide effort, Herps of Texas. So if you report horned lizard sightings in iNaturalist, that state effort picks up those sightings. And so that's very critical for us to use and understand where they still persist and where they don't persist. So absolutely, my research focuses on these specific counties, but the data is being used by Texas Parks and Wildlife via the iNaturalist platform. You don't have to find their project, my project or theirs, to report it. When you enter that, upload that photo with that geo-reference, the projects will pick up the sightings that meet their criteria. So mine picks up those in the counties I named, and then the statewide one picks up any in Texas. So I haven't worked with TCU, but there is a professor at Texas State that's done quite a bit of horned lizard research in Kennedy, and I have spoken with him, and he's doing a lot of DNA research, and so fresh scats, he can analyze the DNA that's in those scats. And so I worked with him to collect some fecal samples, and I've talked with a few of his students. Most of his research has been focused on those urban populations in Kennedy and Karnes City. I know I mentioned very early in my presentation that horned lizards are sensitive to human disturbance. They are, but there's a level of acceptable disturbance. And so these smaller communities seem to be holdouts for lizards. So I found a lizard in Floresville, and then I had confirmed sightings in Falls City, Karnes City, and Kennedy. So except for Stockdale, every city or larger city in the counties had populations of horned lizards. Yes, the San Antonio Zoo does have a population. I have communicated with them and had a few meetings with them. So my long-term goal is to continue with this project even beyond my master's research. If populations, everyone wants to say or would like to think I could potentially have horned lizards released on my property. And so eventually that would be the goal of the zoos. The Dallas-Fort Worth Zoo, or I believe it's the Fort Worth Zoo, has a breeding population, the San Antonio Zoo in Lubbock. And so far, the juvenile lizards have been released on state land, but it's getting to that point where we're trying to understand enough of the ecology of the lizards so that we could potentially release horned lizards on private lands. And typically how that works with other species is you have to meet a habitat criteria. And so the habitat has to be suitable for the population to persist. And then you have to conduct surveys, and there can't be any existing horned lizard populations. So you wouldn't want to release new lizards where lizards already exist. One, because they already exist, but it would create competition. And they're fairly territorial, or they don't really overlap in their habitat use. So they're usually independent of each other, minus breeding time, which is the first when they first emerge from hibernation. Restoration efforts that have been successful. So they have shown promise when they've been released on Mason Mountain Wildlife Management Area. So that's a case where there is managed habitat. It meets the acreage requirements. So there's a minimum acreage where you think a population could exist. And a population is a self-sustaining breeding population. So it will persist into the foreseeable future. There they have done releases, and they have seen, I think, 60% survival the following season. So they do have some little trackers on these. It's a tiny ribbon antenna on these tiny dime-sized lizards. And then they are more adult sized by the following season. So there has been some promise with some of the releases. Do you want citizen scientists to use your mapping program? I don't think I understand the question. I would like citizen science, if you spot a horned lizard, I need to confirm that sighting. So I need a photograph of the lizard, and I need a location. You can provide the location in a variety of ways. You can use your mapping app on your smartphone and drop a pin. You can get a lat long. You can use Google Earth if it's in your yard, and you can zoom in on Google Earth and tell me exactly where the location is. Or you can turn location settings on your camera on your phone if you're using a smartphone. You can also report on the iNaturalist platform. And so that has, you can either enter the lat long in that, or you can zoom in and out on a map and post that there. That's how I've gotten all of my data, and that's how I would like to continue to get the data. If you are using some sort of mapping program, as long as I can get that and enter it, log it as a lat long, then that would work for me. I have not reached out to the Alamo area master naturalist for more outreach. And honestly, I haven't sought out the native prairies of Texas. And it's because initially I was really focused on the Karnes and Wilson County area. And I thought most of the people I might encounter would be in the Bexar County area. I know there's populations in Bexar County. Even in the city, there are still horned lizards that persist in Bexar County. And so I haven't done that, but it is certainly something that I would do. I know that many people have land outside of Bexar County or have friends and family outside of Bexar County. And the Victoria area master naturalist, that would be really good to reach out to as well. I personally don't need the fecal samples. Now, if you see a fecal sample and you take a photograph of that with the lat long, that's as good as an actual lizard. That means the lizard was there. Um, that would work for me as far as the sightings. Matter of fact, I had one of my sightings last season was a fecal pellet, and so I can tell from the photograph. And you saw that I used my chapstick. Something for scale helps, but really the horned lizard scat is so unique. It's pretty obvious from a photograph what it is. It's large relative to the size of the animal, so. Just the photograph where I can see that white spot on it and I can see an ant shell in the cast is all I need. And then our roadrunners are a problem for them. So nothing specializes in eating horned lizards, but everything eats horned lizards. I don't think, I know there was a diet analysis of roadrunners, and I don't even think it was 2% of their diet consisted of baby horned toads. Horned toads are really neat. I said they were cryptic and I said they didn't move. One of their adaptations and defenses is to just submerge in the substrate. So for example, if there's not harvester ants and there's the red imported fire ant, if one runs across its face, it's going to eat it. But we all know that there's never one red fire ant. They swarm you and then begin stinging. And so if that happens to a horned lizard, it will just dig itself down in the sand. The ants can't persist down there. They don't like it. So they come up to the surface fairly quickly. And the lizard stays just an inch or two under the soil, out of sight. They do that in addition when it's hot or cold outside. So they just get a little bit under the ground, no more than 6 inches, but usually 2 or 3 inches. So literally you can stand on top of one and not know it's there. With snakes, if it's a large bull snake, the lizard is not going to flee. It's just going to stand its ground and think, well, potentially you won't see me. Even if the snake sees it, it knows that that one's not venomous. It can inflate itself with air, and so those spikes are even more hard for you to handle that animal. And it just stays its ground, and the snake will go on because it can't get its mouth around that spiky, inflated balloon of a toad. If it's a rattlesnake, however, they know that they're venomous, and so they know this one can get me, and so they'll flee. So they'll run off a short distance and then submerge under the substrate, so that their defense is to remain motionless. They know it works most of the time, and I think that's what allows us to catch them. They sit there, and if we're lucky enough to spot them, we just pick them up. So it seems like that's all of the questions.
Hey, Jamie, I have a
Yes.
question. This is Mike. What's the differences between the Texas horned lizard and the Texas spiny lizard in regards to habitat and diet? And why would one end up on the endangered species list and not the other?
Okay, great question. So I don't know as much about the spiny lizard as I do about the horned lizard, but the spiny lizard is more of a generalist, so it's going to feed on a greater variety of insects, and whereas the horned lizard is really adapted for ants. Even its teeth, the shape of the teeth, as I said, the size of the stomach, it's really specialized. So anytime you have an animal that has very specific requirements, whether it's diet or habitat, that makes it more likely to become threatened. As far as the habitat, some species just do better in urban areas or with human disturbance. So it may not be an urban area, but they can just tolerate our activities better. The spiny lizard seems to be one of those species. So you see it, even if you live in town, you'll see it along a fence or running up and down a tree. So it just has a higher tolerance for us. And so that probably benefits it as well. It's a longer, slender lizard, so it can move through the grasses easier, which probably allows it to tolerate a greater variety of habitat types. Whereas the horned lizard really needs that bare ground and the space between vegetation.
Okay, thank you. I kept a beehive in my backyard for a while, and there was a Texas spiny lizard that lived in the tree and got really fat off my bees. So,
Yeah, yeah, can eat sky raisins. That's pretty, yeah, they're pretty neat animals. And he found a ready-made food source. And the horned lizard is kind of like that too. So if you think of the harvester ants or cut ants, they just have this long line of going out and harvesting and bringing back to the mound. And so the lizard doesn't move to hunt or anything. He just sits there, and when he feels like it, he picks one up and eats it. So it's a very lazy, if it comes to actually hunting or chasing after insects, it doesn't have the skills or the maneuverability to do that.
okay, thank you.
Sure. One last, let's see. Okay, so is there truth that fire ants have led to the decline? Yes, to some degree it has. It's not the complete reason. It's easy to blame them because it's easy to hate fire ants, but there's a variety of reasons for population declines. As I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, exotic grasses. So all those things have probably contributed to the decline. And the desert horned lizard is another species. So there are, I believe, 5 horned lizard species. And the Texas horned lizard is specifically the one I'm speaking of. There's just subtle differences in their horns and tail length and tail shape. Yes, it is illegal to sell any native wildlife. It's illegal to collect Texas horned lizards and sell those for the pet trade. The pet trade up from the 50s through the 80s potentially contributed to their population decline as well. Okay, so I think that is it for me. I really appreciate your time, and I will, let's see, let me figure out how to stop sharing my screen.
I don't think you're sharing anymore.
Okay. Okay, so I will turn my,
Can you, Jamie, real quick, post the contact information you had up earlier in the chat so people can grab it from there? And thank you very much for coming tonight. And so anybody who wants to stick around, we're going to have Don talk about the upcoming bio blitz that are going to happen in May. So Don, if you're ready.